So we're also enormously pleased today to welcome Jennifer Tress. Jennifer is a writer and speaker based in Arlington, Virginia, whose work has appeared in anthologies and magazines. In August 2013, she released her first book, a memoir titled You're Not Pretty Enough, which received international press coverage. I'm going to let her tell you how she came up with the title. She's also the founder of the You're Not Pretty Enough project, which is designed to provide women and some men with the support and tools to build healthy self-esteem. Please welcome Jennifer.
It's so great to be here. Thank you so much to all of you for having me here. And yes, like Deborah said, this is a book about my defining moments, sort of the big moments that contributed to how I view myself, and they're universal stories though that have a twist, right? And so the title comes from a story in which my ex-husband used to say I wasn't pretty enough for him as a reason why he was having an affair. And that's clearly why he's my ex. But the interesting part about this is that, I started really seriously writing and for publication, and was working on this book and doing storytelling, live storytelling in the DC and New York area. And I think you all have a storytelling series here called The Stoop, right, in Baltimore, if you're all familiar with that, where it's similar to stand-up comedy in a sense that you have about a 7 to 8 minute bit to tell like a big story in your life, right? But there's a narrative arc there. And so of all the stories I told, and they were sort of working stories from this book, the You're Not Pretty Enough story was the one that really resonated with people, because I think everybody, but women especially, have had those moments in our lives where we've all wondered that about ourselves. And the pretty thing, as I've found out, becomes sometimes the entree into self-esteem issues, because it's the laziest, easiest way that we assess ourselves and others. And so when it came time for me to put a web presence out there, just like everybody else, right? I chose You're Not Pretty Enough because it was so catchy to people and people really resonated with it, but I thought it would only be sort of a joke, an inside joke between me and the people who knew that story, who had heard that story. But what I found was something very interesting happened, and that was I found people were Googling and finding me because they were Googling, will I ever be pretty enough for anybody to love me? How to be pretty when I'm not? What to do when you're not pretty? And seeing that month after month, thousands of hits month after month of people finding me made me really sad, but also made me wonder, what does the internet say to you when you ask that question? It seemed to me like asking a magic 8-ball, like ask again later. And it really, but what I found was that there was nothing good that the internet was saying back to you. And so since I felt like I had this opportunity, because people were coming to my site and then just leaving because they're going, who is this Jen Tress woman? I wanted to turn that around. And so I started working with universities in the area, including Loyola here in Baltimore, as well as George Washington and George Mason University. And I set up on campuses. I worked with the Women and Gender Studies departments. I set up on campuses. I administered hundreds of surveys around this and collected video responses, very much modeled after the It Gets Better project by Dan Savage. And wound up turning my site over to be primarily focused on that content. So now there are over 70 videos of people talking about this. And I ask questions like, when was the last time you felt not pretty enough? What was driving that feeling? And it was always a very different answer of what was driving that feeling. And then how did you get out of it? It was always important to me to not stay mired in that feeling, but to get out of that feeling. And now there's a big support group out there for people to really who are those future and current Googlers who are asking that question now. They now have a space to really explore that feeling in a way that's authentic, productive, and empowered. So the book is really sort of an accompanying piece to that now, but they're all stories about sort of the big impacts that we have on our self-esteem, and how do those things define us, and how should they not define us, and move forward. So I'm not going to read that story because that's a very long, complicated one, but I am going to read a good passage from there. So thank you for that indulgence. I knew pretty early that I liked material things, and that if I wanted them, I needed to make my own money. So at 12, I started babysitting. Besides a few odd jobs here and there, I babysat consistently for one family only, our next door neighbors, the Cooks. Matt Cook was a tall, lanky mechanic He was also the president of the Sly Fox motorcycle gang. So he seemed like a badass, but he had these gentle eyes and reminded me so much of Jim Croce that I couldn't help but hum Bad, Bad Leroy Brown whenever I saw him. His wife, Leslie, was a barfly pixie. She was tiny and pretty, just over 5 feet and just under 100 pounds, and sported frosted, perfectly feathered hair that came to her shoulders. She had an easy demeanor and a voice that sounded like she smoked and drank every Friday night, which she did. They both did, and we liked them. They had a tow-headed 2-year-old son named Cody who was all giggles and curiosity. I sat for them when they went to the local neighborhood bar, PC's, which has since burned down but remained for years as a charred homage to crushed dreams. Cody and I filled our evenings performing typical babysitter kid activities, making cookies, watching TV, and me trying to convince him that he was really tired and it was time to go to bed now. We also invented a game that, looking back, I suppose, spoke to the more dominant, submissive sides of our respective personalities. It was simple, and it involved me continuously tripping him. I'd take the cushions from the sofas and pile them on either ends of the living room, and Cody would start at one end and gather up as much speed as one could with stubby legs in a 14-foot length space and run toward the other end of the room. I'd stick my foot out at the appropriate time, which would trip him and send him face first into the pillows. He'd always shoot up, giggling profusely, and demand, "Again!" Sometimes the giggling would start before my foot even shot out, the anticipation nearly toppling him on its own. We'd do this for at least an hour, and once we'd get our rhythm, my foot would take on its own life, instinctively knowing when to shoot out as I watched TV. After I put him to bed, it was time to wait for the return of Leslie. Being tiny, her alcohol tolerance was very low, so she always returned home earlier than her husband and highly intoxicated. The first time I babysat for the Cooks, it was around 8 when I heard Leslie stumbling up the steps. After a couple failed attempts to unlock the door, I got up and opened it. "Hi, Zal," she beamed. "These keys don't open shit!" And I looked down and saw that she was jiggling the slack part of her metal belt. "What'd you guys do?" she slurred as she fell back on the couch, and then, "Ooh, cookies! Can I have one?" I brought her the plate, and she took one and winked at me. "This one looks perfect." Not knowing the protocol for getting paid for an honest night's work, but feeling it was important that I got my money before I left the house, I waited for her to hand me some cash. Instead, we sat and watched the Dukes of Hazzard at opposite ends of the couch for a while until I got up to go to the bathroom and plan my exit. When I returned, Leslie was passed out, nearly horizontal, and her right breast had popped out of the tan suede vest that was the only piece of clothing she wore on the top half of her body. I just stared at the small orb, not knowing what to do. Do I try to push her boob back in, I asked myself? Are you kidding? This is above our pay grade. Call Mom. When we walked into the house, she took in Leslie, who was in the exact same state. And then she looked at me, and seeing that I was all wide-eyed, she let out a little laugh, which made me laugh. "Leslie," Mom called out. Nothing. "Leslie," my mom said again, this time nudging her gently. The orb shook. She responded. "Leslie, I'm going to make some coffee." Leslie swatted at the air breezily as if signaling that she was just fine the way she was. My mom brought her the coffee and propped Leslie up so that she could drink it. Her breast thankfully slid back into its hiding place. "Thanks, hon," Leslie said, rubbing her eyes and wrapping her hands around the mug. Mom sent me back home because my sister was alone and followed a little while later with my $10 for services rendered. Another time, after I put Cody to bed, the phone rang and I picked it up to hear my mom on the end. "Look out the front window." I pulled the phone with me and peered out. The Cooks lived at the top of a fairly long driveway, and at the bottom I could see a figure wobbling around on all fours. "Is that Leslie?" I asked. "Yep," my mom said. "That's Leslie, the all-terrain vehicle." "Wow. Should we help her?" "No." And then she followed up with a phrase that's probably the first time I remember irony staring me straight in the face. "She hates to be embarrassed." We watched her make the slow crawl up the driveway together on the phone. Every so often she'd stop and put the jacket she was holding on the ground and lay down. "She taking a nap?" I asked. "Looks that way." "I'll make the coffee," I said. I was making a lot of coffee in those days, and not just for the Cooks. My parents divorced when I was 7. Divorce is disorienting, especially for the kids. Suddenly we went from one house to 2 and from 2 parents to 4 as both my mom and dad remarried. My dad was climbing up the corporate ladder and soon had a nice new house where we had great clothes and toys, but we had to keep them there. My mom wasn't making a lot of money in those days, and so we didn't have time for those things at her house and had to go on food stamps for a while. It was confusing. As a kid, I attended a Unitarian church with my family. When my parents separated, they must have arranged who would go as a means to avoid each other because I don't remember seeing them there at the same time again. One day, in the children's class, when I was around 6, I was asked to light a candle and burnt my finger in the process. Later, we all congregated in the main communal area where the church served refreshments. I sat sulking in a corner while the other children played, with my finger wrapped in a cold, wet cloth and elevated on the table. A man approached me. He had slightly long, curly brown hair and wore a funky shirt with a navy blue corduroy blazer and jeans. He asked what happened, but I didn't say anything, so he kneeled down to my level. "I have a daughter," she said. "She looks kind of like you." He nodded towards my hand and smiled at me. "Can I take a look?" I gave him my hand. "What's her name?" I asked. "Jules," he said, and unwrapped the cloth. "You know what helps?" I shook my head no. "If you wet it and blow on it." And he dabbed my finger in a wet cloth and told me to do just that. And he was right. "Hello," my mom said as she knelt down beside us and grabbed my knee. "I'm Jenny's mom, Kathy. I haven't seen you here before." She wore her hair long in those days and was dressed in a flouncy skirt and light blue knit sweater with no bra. He noticed. "I'm a new member," he replied and smiled. They started to chat and then slowly stood up. "Keep blowing on that finger, Jenny," he said, and I watched them talk and flirt while I kicked my stocking legs under the chair. They married a couple years later. We lived in a neighborhood that was poor and was made up of summer cottages situated around a lake that were converted into permanent residences. As I grew older, I grew more embarrassed about where we lived. From far away, it was beatific and peaceful, but when I became a teenager, I became hyper-aware of how appearances from all aspects of one's life translate into who you are and how people view you. In junior high, I'd hear people talking either directly or indirectly about my neighborhood, and despite the status it achieved by housing a couple of popular kids, I was left with the clear impression that my community was the proverbial other side of the tracks. And this was in a town where the tracks were pretty modest to begin with. When I viewed my neighborhood through that lens, several descriptors came to mind: deadbeat, poor, run down. This was now how I wanted people to see me, so I distanced myself from the tiny houses where the paint and siding were stripping away. I distanced myself from the lawns littered with debris and cars and trucks and the people who proudly sported mullets and openly drank alcohol while walking the loop around the lake in naturally faded jeans. Still, we had the woods and that private lake and a beach, and we fished and swam and played outside for as long as the weather would hold us. We also had a big garden and tons of animals: chickens, dogs, cats, lots and lots of cats, which brought with them an army of fleas. My sister and I loved the cats. We hated the fleas. Really? It's so surprising. And at the time, we shared a room, and when we'd enter it, we'd watch as they'd land on our legs in a rush. But there was a bigger parasite in the house, and that was my stepfather, Richard. And he saw the flea situation not so much as a nuisance or even a health hazard. No, he viewed it more as a learning opportunity. That's because he was an entomologist. So he looked for any opportunity to teach my sister and me about insects. The fleas especially loved white socks, and when we'd wear them, they would cling to us faster, more volume, and stay longer. My stepfather would give us glasses of soapy water, which killed them immediately, and we'd sit on the floor, pluck them off, put them into the water, and watch them float to the bottom and drown. There were other teachings about insects. Randomly, he'd launch drills that require my sister and me to go outside and collect bugs. We'd pin them on cork boards, and he'd help us identify them by the unique tapestry of their shells and wings. Sort of like that. We did not like his other attempts to gain our interest on that topic, though, which included cooking larvae, crickets, and other insects for us to snack on, saying that Americans are in the cultural minority by not including insects in their food pyramid. Yeah, no thanks, I'd say. I use my food stamp allowance on this bag of yodels, so I'm all set. When we first met Richard, he was cool, open, playful, more of a friend. After he and my mom married, he was home with my sister and me a lot after school. My mom worked full-time, often overtime, at a hotel across the street. Richard worked only sporadically as a beekeeper inspector, testing northern Ohio hives for foul brood disease. He was incredibly smart. Early on in his career, he discovered a beetle, and he became the preeminent scholar and professor on said beetle, which led to numerous articles and prestigious beetle-related publications. So it wasn't like he couldn't get work, it's just that he would only work when he was sober, which wasn't often. He rested, intoxicated on his beetle-related laurels. This mix of smarts, oddness, and drunkenness created the perfect storm for creating and doling out punishments. For instance, we used to keep cat food in the oven, which was a normal place to keep it, to prevent all our cats from scratching open the bags. I used the oven a lot to heat up snacks after school for my sister and me, and almost always I forgot the cat food was in there. Soon the smell of burnt meow mix would waft through the house. Yelling didn't work, neither did sending me to my room. What worked was one day Richard telling me that if I was so fond of wasting the cat food, then perhaps I should just eat it. You know, kill two birds with one stone. Eat the cat food, I asked. That's what I said. Well, how am I supposed to do that? He went to the cupboard and pulled out a bowl and then a spoon and set it on the table in front of me. Then he grabbed the burnt cat food from out of the oven and poured it into the bowl and then took some milk out of the fridge and poured it on top of the cat food. That's how. He leaned against the kitchen counter, crossed his arms, and watched. This made me feel like I was in the midst of a battle of the wits, and I wanted to win. Now, I'm a rebel from way back, and there's a photo in here, but I am a descendant of the Dalton Gang, which was a major crime gang back in the late 1800s, and they were train robbers. And in Kansas City, Missouri, in the late 1800s, they all were found and killed in this train robbery, save one of the Daltons. So, having that in my blood, I did what any 9-year-old rebel would do. I ate the cat food, which had the texture and shape of Lucky Charms cereal and tasted like burnt, salty toast. I said, looking at my stepfather, this is the best meal I've ever had. Richard stormed out of the room and slammed his bedroom door. I took the bowl of cat food away and threw it in the woods. At night, Richard would goad my mom into partying. One night I remember them playing Another One Bites the Dust by Queen over and over until I yelled, could you please keep it down? Some of us have to get up in the morning. They'd giggle and go into their bedroom where they'd drink some more and eventually fight and slam doors. Richard was a mean drunk, critical, and so bitter about his own divorce that my mom often pointed out to him, you know you hate your ex-wife more than you love me. When I officially became a teenager, my mom got a job as an account manager in an advertising agency in Cleveland. She had $10 in her checking account. Richard wasn't contributing much financially, but she immediately took us off the food stamp program as a symbolic measure and stopped drinking as a literal one. She felt she was at a crossroads and decided to take the more serious path. Richard wasn't pleased to lose his drinking buddy and frequently left the house at night. Soon after I entered 8th grade, I became boy crazy. So when the boy I had the most massive crush on asked if I would be at the football game that Friday, I said yes, louder than necessary. I was obligated to babysit for our next door neighbors, the Cooks, as I did almost every Friday night, but procrastinated in telling them. And then a massive snowstorm hit the area the same week, which was not unusual from October through April in Northeast Ohio. What was also not unusual was the life must go on sentiment of my people when it came to the weather. This meant that the high school football game would go on as scheduled, and this also meant that the Cooks would be looking forward to slinging back Jack Daniels by 5:30 p.m. at the bar. By Friday after school, I knew the clock had run out. I needed to get permission to go to the game, but in doing so, I would reveal I was shirking my responsibilities with the Cooks. My mom was still at work, so I had to clear it with Richard. Damn it! I told him that I wanted to go to the game more than anything, and anticipating his protest, threw in and I need to experience life for once statement. I could see the wheels turning in his mind. Sure, he said. Go right on over and let him know. Really? Is that easy? Yep, go on over. Just go over in your bare feet. Ah, there it is. But there's snow on the ground, so I'll catch cold. Well, you wanted to experience life for once. For reasons I still don't understand, I determined it whacked but inarguable logic and set out immediately before he changed his mind. The snow crunched when I stepped into it and went up to my mid-calf, so I ran in quick steps to ward off the cold and numbness. I knocked on my neighbor's door and Mr. Cook opened it. I have to go to the football game because Mike just broke up with Kim and she's really upset, but she doesn't want to tell her parents, and so she really needs to be out of the house, but I'm the only person she'll talk to, and Richard said I could go as long as I came over in my bare feet and told you and you didn't care. Mac looked at the bare shins and feet and smiled at me kindly, but his eyes were sad. Well, I'm bummed you didn't tell me earlier, man, but okay. Okay, thanks, I said, and turned to trounce back. Hey, Mac called after me. I turned to look at him, shivering. Tell Richard he's an asshole and that I will kick his ass if he ever makes you do something like... And he waved his hands angrily at my legs. Okay, I said. Call back to the house. Turned back to the house. What did he say, Richard asked. That I could go. And that was it. No big lesson. My mom and Richard divorced that same year. It was weird to see him go, but I didn't particularly feel attached. On the day he left, I was outside reading a book in the grass, leaning up against a tree. He came over and knelt down to my level just like I was a kid with that burned figure at the church. I'm leaving, he said. Keep your studies up. You're smart. Okay, bye. I never saw him again. Never heard from him. But I still remain fascinated by bees. Thank you.